What is up, guys? So today we are back with another deep dive, diving deeper into the Nightmare Cup, and whew, today is kind of one of those, like, I guess you would say, like, B-tier picks. Like, this Pokemon isn't, like, super duper amazing because it has another Pokemon, like, on top of it, I guess you could say. It's living in Hypno's shadow. But I definitely think that you shouldn't count out Chimecho just because Hypno is a thing, because Chimecho actually has some interesting points. So Chimecho is a pure Psychic type Pokemon, maxing out at level 40 with 15s across the board at 2259. Not too shabby there. Now with a 0 on attack, 14 defense, and 15 stamina at level 25.5, you can achieve a even 1500, so that's always nice. Now that IV combination right there does actually yield you the maximum amount of stat product inside of the Great League, so that's important to know. Now according to my spreadsheets and all the numbers that I have ran, Chimecho should be right around 16th in bulk and actually 16th in stat product, so pretty decent numbers there. And of course all of that comes from our base stats here, which are relatively nice. They're all at least kind of baselined here, so 175 on attack, 170 defense, and 181 on stamina. Now, of course, that isn't the ideal stat spread, but hey, that's pretty good considering what we're working with. Moving on to our moves here, so Chimecho actually falls into this weird category inside of the Psychic typings as a non-confusion user. And that's because Chimecho actually doesn't have access to confusion. If it did, I do think some of its matchups would be a little bit different, but having access to extrasensory actually may give it a little bit of an edge in certain matchups. So our first fast move that we actually have here is Astonish, which is a ghost type move, so of course we do not get a stab bonus off of that. 3 energy per turn for 1.67 damage per turn. Not too great there. Extrasensory though, 3.33 energy per turn, so already doing better than Astonish. And then we actually have 2.67 damage per turn, but after stab we actually get bumped up to this 3.2, so that is even better. Definitely want to go with extrasensory as far as your fast move goes. Next, moving on to our charge moves here, we do have 3 different charge moves. Only Psyshock is a stab candidate here, so that's not hitting on a whole lot, but there's some interesting things to be said here. So Energy Ball costing 60 for 90 damage at a 1.5 damage per energy ratio, not too shabby. Shadow Ball costing 55 for 100 damage at a 1.82, which is great. Psyshock here for 45 energy, you do get 70 damage out of that for a 1.56 damage per energy ratio. And after stab it does bump it up to 84 damage, which gives us a 1.86 damage per energy ratio. So not too shabby. Now, Energy Ball does have a uniqueness to it. Considering that it is a grass type move, it can actually help in a couple of matchups in the meta, like Poliwrath and Crawdaunt, Sharpedo, you know, a couple of obscure Pokemon. The problem with it though is that I think it's a little too obscure. Shadow Ball and Psyshock definitely hit a lot more in the meta, and I just definitely think that they would be a lot better suited unless you just really know inside of your own meta that there's going to be a lot of ground type, water type Pokemon running around that Energy Ball would be useful for. So in terms of all the simulations for this video, Extrasensory, Shadow Ball, and Psyshock is the moveset that we went with for this particular video. So moving on into our shield situations here, we have a 0 versus 0, or the mock-up like closing type situation, 47.8. Not too shabby. 50% is a good solid number, considering that means we would beat most of one type and a little bit of another, and then kind of have issues with the third type, so 47 is not too shabby. 2 versus 0 though, whenever I have 2 shields and my opponent doesn't have any, we actually end up winning 71.6% of those. But I'm not too worried about which Pokemon we actually end up winning. I'm actually worried about the Pokemon that we lose against, because if I have complete shield advantage, I want to know which Pokemon are just going to flat out beat me no matter what. And I do have Darks written up there. And that's a pretty safe thing to assume. If it's a Dark type Pokemon going up against your Chimecho, pure psychic typing, we don't have a lot to combat the dark types with. We only have, you know, psychic and ghost. So we don't have a whole lot to actually use up against the dark types, unfortunately. Next we have our 0 versus 2, which is where I don't have any shields and my opponent actually carries 2 shields. We actually end up winning 9%. And I'm actually worried about which 9% that is, because if my opponent actually has 2 full shields and I don't have any, I'd like to know which Pokemon I actually end up beating there. And out of that 9%, we have things like Machop, Machoke, Hitmonchan, Toxicroak, Wobbuffet, and Drowsy. And some of those make some sense, like the fighting types, that makes a lot of sense. Toxicroak, definitely making a lot of sense considering that quad weakness to Psychic. Wobbuffet, unfortunately not able to output enough damage for us. And Drowsy, not really hitting on a whole lot with its stats, and it doesn't really have that great of a move pool, but I don't think you should really have to worry about Drowsy either way. Next we have our 2 versus 2, or in a mock-up like opening type situation. We actually win 40.3%. Meh. So what that actually tells us is that we actually do statistically prefer to close with Chimecho. We actually will end up winning more matches as a closer than we would as an opener. Speaking of matches, let's actually get into some of these. So in all of my deep dives, I ended up taking our subject Pokemon, Chimecho today of course, and I put them up against the top 10 bulkiest Pokemon just to kind of see how they do. Now one thing I do want to remind you is that everything on this board is actually ran in a 1 versus 1 shield scenario so that we can kind of give the most evenness to both Pokemon. So in terms of our top 10, this is pretty nice. I mean, it's pretty even here. So you'll see Wobbuffet, Metang, Slowbro, Slowking, and Hypno. I need to speak about Hypno first. Are our wins. Now, as far as losses go, we do have Umbreon, Claydol, Bronzong, Alolan Raticate, and Grumpig. A couple of these make sense considering they do carry some dark type moves, like Bronzong can actually end up beating us, Umbreon and Alolan Raticate. But Grumpig, now the Grumpig matchup is actually a tie, but if you play the shields correctly, it literally comes down to who ends up shielding the super effective damage first, because both Pokemon can actually tank one hit from a psychic move, and then it's basically down to who can get off Shadow Ball first in the Grumpig match. Now in Bronzong it's a little bit different because Bronzong can have Feint Attack, which is a pretty good move to go up against a pure Psychic type with, of course. But if you do give it Confusion, it actually still can end up winning with only 5 health remaining. And then we have Hypno. So I have Hypno under the win because we've done a versus video on Hypno versus Chimecho. In that video we did talk about how Chimecho can beat the Hypno. If you go just under PvPoke and you're actually just trying to look up a Hypno versus Chimecho, it will tell you that Chimecho actually does lose up against the Hypno. PvPoke tries to give Hypno 2 legacy moves, which that shouldn't be possible, considering that Shadow Ball and Psyshock were both legacy before PvP was introduced. You'd have to give it some other move. Psyshock actually allows Hypno to win this matchup because it fires so fast. If it has Focus Blast, it loses. If it has Future Sight, it loses. If it has Psychic, it loses. It literally will lose unless it has Psyshock. But if you take away your Shadow Ball and give it Psyshock, even then it still loses. It needs both Psyshock and Shadow Ball to actually beat the Chimecho, which should not be possible. Now let's actually move on to our countering section here. So this section is actually where we talk about what do we actually focus our attention on with Chimecho versus what should we actually be bringing to the table to combat the Chimecho. Well, in terms of what we actually should focus on, that one's kind of clear cut. The fighting types really do have a big problem with us. We actually have 3 wins and 1 loss. We actually have 3 losses and 1 tie inside of the fighting types here. So we actually end up losing to Lucario, Machamp, and Heracross. And our tie is up against Primeape. So these do make a little bit of sense if you think about it. Lucario is going to have that weird typing issue where it doesn't take super effective damage against the Psychics, so it's not too bad. Machamp having a ton of neutral damage with ever Rock Slide, or if it actually has Cross Chop, usually Cross Chop does give it the speed that it needs to actually break down a Psychic type. Heracross having access to bug type moves, not too big of a deal. And then Primeape actually having access to, what is it, Nightshade? Night something? Night Slash. Thank you for the correction down there in the comments. I see you typing already. And then from there, it just kind of gets a little bit easier. So Gallade is actually a pretty close matchup. Hitmonchan, Machoke, Poliwrath. Then they really start to get easy here. Monferno, Blaziken, Hitmontop, Hariyama, Breloom, Machop, Toxicroak, of course, is going to fall really hard. And Hitmonlee actually falls really hard as well. So not too big of a surprise that the fighting types are definitely where we want to focus our attention. Now, as far as what we should bring to the table to actually combat a Chimecho, Dark types are pretty much going to destroy the Chimecho here. So the closest that we can get to a win is actually Alolan Muck. But even then, that one's not even kind of close. And it just gets worse and worse from there. Our worst possible matchup is actually Mighty Ina, oddly enough. And then Tyranitar, Alolan Raticate, Umbreon, Sharpedo, Drapion, Murkrow, all of these Pokemon really just run over the Chimecho and just literally make it like a no-brainer. Then we get to our beautiful Psychic types here. So I have half and half written down because there's a lot of these Pokemon that actually do pretty well here, but there's a lot of Pokemon that don't. We can actually win against a lot of these Pokemon simply based on whether they have enough neutral damage to get to their charge moves before we can get to our charge move. So Extra Sensory allows us to get to Shadow Ball pretty quickly, and things like Slowbro and Slowking actually end up having a big issue going up against Chimecho because even though they're outputting a lot of neutral damage, they're not able to get to their charge moves to run us over before we can get to Shadow Ball and actually beat them. But then you start talking about Pokemon like Claydol, not looking too hot. Bronzong again, not too hot. Xatu, Alolan Raichu, no. All of those Pokemon have a ton of neutral damage, or they have access to their charge moves faster than what we do. It's almost like a race to the charge moves, and if you have neutral damage rather than resisted Psychic type damage to combat us with, then you really just can give Chimecho a run for its money. Otherwise, you do have a lot of Psychic matchups that are in your favor. Now let's actually talk a little bit about some pros and some cons for our Chimecho here. I only have one for both sides though. So as far as our con goes, unfortunately, he's not as dominating as some of the other Psychic types. Things like Alolan Raichu, Xatu, Hypno even actually has a lot of more favorable matchups. So we kind of just fall to the back. We're literally living in the shadow of these other Psychic types. But as our pro, we actually are a pretty decent specialist up against the fighting typing. Once we figure out that we have this like really nice package to combat a lot of the fighting types, I really think that's what makes Chimecho's role in this cup. He's definitely a specialist towards the fighters, but unfortunately that's kind of it. Like, he doesn't really have a good general spread. With this 47, that's pretty nice, but 40% really starts to tank, and only having 9% whenever your back is up against the wall with no shields, oh, it really hurts. It's just really hard to get behind Chimecho and say, yes, put him on your team. So that is actually my opinion on Chimecho today, guys. Thank you so much for hanging out. Thank you so much for watching. I've said it, and I'm going to unfortunately probably say it every day this week, but we are nearing the end of the Nightmare Cup. Please, if you guys have any Pokemon that you haven't suggested yet, please let me know, as I'd love to get to those. But more importantly, the Versus videos are pretty much going to wrap up our experience with the Nightmare Cup before we move on to the next cup for June. As soon as they announce it on the 18th, I believe it is, as soon as they announce it, we're going to be moving on to that cup. So if you guys have any suggestions, make sure you leave them down below. If not, It's all good. Just remember that if you like to like videos, you could do that, but if you don't, you can be that guy. Otherwise, let me know what you have to say down in the comments. And until our next video, I will catch you then.